The headquarters of Langston and Myers Tower loomed above the city like a glass and steel monument to ambition. Its lobby gleamed with Italian marble and chrome, every surface polished until it reflected the faces of those who passed. Executives hurried across the floor with leather briefcases and designer heels clicking against the stone. Assistants clutched tablets, whispering into wireless headsets as if each syllable they spoke might decide the fate of millions. The air smelled faintly of cologne, expensive perfume, and fresh coffee imported from Brazil. In the midst of all this corporate orchestration, a single figure bent low over the glass coffee table in the executive lounge. A young black maid, dressed in a starched uniform of navy blue with a white apron, carefully wiped a cloth across the surface. She moved with precision, not because anyone was watching, most barely noticed her, but because her dignity required it. Every streak had to vanish, every fingerprint erased. Her name was Amara, though to most of the executives who passed, she was simply the maid, a background figure as invisible as the hum of the air conditioning. The hush of the lobby broke suddenly. The elevator doors slid open with a metallic sigh, and from within emerged Richard Langston, CEO and co-founder. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, his silver hair slicked back to reveal a face carved with power and impatience. His suit, dark charcoal with subtle pinstripes, was cut by a Seville Row tailor, and his wrist bore a platinum watch that could buy a house in the suburbs. The instant he stepped into the room, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations stuttered and halted. Assistants lowered their voices. Even the receptionist at the front desk straightened her posture. Richard Langston carried authority like a weapon. His reputation was legend, ruthless in the boardroom, merciless in negotiations, feared by competitors and subordinates alike. He had once been quoted in a magazine saying, "Business isn't about fairness, it's about dominance." People believed him. They also believed he was capable of firing anyone on the spot for the smallest slight. Amara, still kneeling at the glass table, became aware of the hush around her. She didn't look up immediately. She had learned long ago that direct eye contact with men like Langston could invite unwanted trouble. But the faint scuff of his Italian shoes approaching made her pause, cloth hovering mid-wipe. "Who left this table like this?" His voice cut through the lobby, sharp as broken glass. He wasn't asking, he was accusing. Amara glanced at the table. It gleamed under the lobby lights, spotless by any reasonable standard. But Langston's reflection showed a faint smear, the kind of imperfection only visible at a certain angle in a certain light. She rose to her feet quickly, cloth folded neatly in her hands. "Sir, I've just cleaned it," she said softly, her voice careful, respectful, measured. His eyes fixed on her like a predator's. "Just cleaned it? Look at that." He jabbed a finger at the faint mark. "Do you think I pay people millions of dollars to walk into a lobby that looks like a train station? Do you think image doesn't matter?" A murmur spread across the room. Assistants glanced at one another, uneasy. An intern near the reception desk flushed red, staring at the floor as if she'd been the one accused. But no one intervened. No one ever did. Amara's grip on the cloth tightened. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, the humiliation blooming in her chest like fire. Her job depended on silence, on swallowing her pride, on letting moments like these pass. For years, she had done exactly that. Langston wasn't finished. His voice rose, filling the marble cavern. "This is the problem with people these days. No pride in their work. No discipline. Everything has to be done twice because nobody gets it right the first time." He gestured broadly, his suit jacket flaring. "Do you understand what kind of company this is? Do you understand the level of excellence I demand? Amara stood frozen. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs, but her face remained calm. She had been raised to know that showing weakness only invited more cruelty. Inside, though, a storm was brewing. Langston leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough that the room leaned in to hear. If you can't do a simple task like this properly, he said, maybe you don't belong here. Maybe you don't belong in this building at all. The words struck harder than the volume of his earlier tirade. They weren't about a smudge anymore, they were about her place in this world. The message was clear, in his eyes, she was beneath him, not just in title or salary, but in worth. For a moment, the entire lobby held its breath. Even the receptionist's fingers paused over her keyboard. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the steady tick of Langston's platinum watch. Amara's eyes lifted at last, meeting his directly. Something shifted in her gaze, something steady, unshaken. She did not speak, yet, but the silence between them grew heavier, denser, as though her refusal to shrink back was its own kind of defiance. Langston narrowed his eyes, mistaking her composure for insolence. "Well?" he demanded. His voice carried again, commanding, echoing. "Do you have nothing to say for yourself?" And though the words he wanted, a stammered apology, a frightened promise to do better, did not come, the answer was forming within her. It would not be today, not in this opening act of confrontation, but soon. And when it came, it would land with a weight that no board meeting, no $1 million contract, no executive order could rival. For now, the commanding voice belonged to him. But the silence that followed belonged to her, and it was more powerful than he could ever realize. The employees watching shifted uneasily, sensing something had changed in the script of the usual humiliation. They didn't yet know what. Neither did Langston. But Amara knew. Her moment was coming. And when it arrived, one sentence would shake the tower to its core. The echo of Richard Langston's tirade lingered long after he had stormed into his private elevator. The sharp cadence of his words still seemed to cling to the marble walls of the lobby, reverberating like a bad memory no one could shake. For a while, silence pressed down on the room, an unnatural, heavy quiet. Then, as if a curtain had lifted, the whispers began. Executives in tailored suits leaned toward each other, muttering in voices so low they barely stirred the air. Assistants scurried toward their desks, eyes wide, phones buzzing in their hands as they texted colleagues upstairs. Even the security guards at the revolving doors exchanged furtive glances, their postures stiff but their ears straining to catch every word. "What was that about?" someone whispered near the reception desk. "He lost it over a table," another voice replied. "A smear, barely visible." "That poor girl," murmured a young intern, clutching her tablet tighter. "She didn't deserve that." "She's lucky she still has a job," came the cynical retort from a senior accountant, shaking his head. "Langston doesn't tolerate mistakes, doesn't matter if you clean tables or close deals." And yet, despite their words, every voice carried the same undercurrent, unease. Langston's fury was nothing new. He had barked at board members, fired directors in the middle of meetings, and once slammed a chair across a conference room in a fit of rage. But something about this moment was different. The target had not been a rival executive or an underperforming manager. It had been a maid. A woman whose role was meant to be invisible. By humiliating her so publicly, Langston had ripped the veil off something no one wanted to name, how fragile their own places were in his empire. Amara returned to her duties quietly, as though nothing had happened. She bent once more over the table, smoothing her cloth across the glass until even the faintest suggestion of a smear vanished. Her face betrayed nothing, no anger, no tears. But that very composure unsettled those watching. "She didn't even flinch," whispered a woman from HR, standing near the elevators. "I thought she'd cry, or run out. But she just stood there." "That silence was louder than anything he said," another added, shaking his head slowly. The whispers multiplied as the day wore on. In the cafeteria at noon, conversations paused when Amara entered to refill the supply cart. Eyes followed her, some sympathetic, others calculating. At one corner table, a group of junior associates dissected the incident like analysts reviewing market data. "He crossed a line," one of them said, spearing a piece of chicken with his fork. There were clients in the lobby. "Did you see their faces?" "I don't think he cares," another replied. "He is the company. He thinks no one will challenge him." A third leaned in, lowering his voice even further. "But did you notice?" She looked him in the eye at the end. "Not many people do that. I've seen VPs shrink under his glare." The remark sent a ripple through the group. They glanced at Amara again, but she moved with quiet efficiency, never acknowledging the stares. To them, she was an enigma, someone who bore the brunt of humiliation without breaking, someone who carried herself with a poise that seemed out of place for her uniform. By late afternoon, the whispers had reached the upper floors. In the executive suite, behind glass doors and mahogany desks, conversations grew cautious. The board members, most of whom owed their positions to Langston's relentless ambition, discussed the lobby scene in guarded tones. "He can't keep doing this," muttered one, pacing near a window that overlooked the city. "We're not running a military camp." "Careful," another warned, eyes flicking toward the hallway. "Words travel fast here. And you know how he deals with dissent." Still, the discomfort was undeniable. Langston's tirade had shaken the foundation of their carefully managed image. Investors liked strength, but not volatility. Clients liked confidence, but not cruelty. Already, there were rumors that one potential partner had left the building early, unsettled by what they'd witnessed in the lobby. Meanwhile, in the service corridors behind the glossy facade, the staff spoke more openly. The janitors, kitchen workers, and custodians gathered in the break room, their voices carrying the raw honesty that the executives upstairs dared not voice. "He thinks he can scream at us like we're nothing," one said, shaking his head. But she stood her ground. "Did you see her eyes? That wasn't fear. That was fire." "Mark my words," another chimed in, "one day, someone's gonna say something back. And when they do, it'll cut deeper than his shouting ever could." The others nodded. For them, Amara wasn't just another employee. She was one of their own, a quiet figure who worked tirelessly, always respectful, always precise. To see her targeted ignited something, an unspoken solidarity, a shared understanding that Langston's power had limits, even if those limits had yet to be tested. As dusk settled and the city's lights flickered to life outside the tower, Amara wheeled her cleaning cart down the long, empty hallway of the executive floor. The polished glass walls reflected her image back at her, a double moving silently through a world that pretended not to see her. She felt the weight of the whispers trailing behind her, echoing in every corridor she passed. She did not resent them. Whispers were the language of fear, and fear was the currency Richard Langston had built his empire upon. But she knew something no one else did: fear could be overturned in a moment, by truth spoken aloud. At the far end of the hallway, she paused by a window overlooking the city. The skyline glittered against the night sky, cold and magnificent. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the stirrings of resolve. Langston's voice had filled the lobby like thunder. But whispers could become storms. And when storms broke, even towers of glass and steel could shatter. The night after the confrontation, Amara sat alone at her small kitchen table, her uniform folded neatly on the chair beside her. The hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet apartment, punctuated now and then by the distant sound of traffic drifting through the thin walls. She stared at a chipped mug of tea, steam curling upward and fading into nothing. Her body was tired, but her mind replayed the moment in the lobby with unrelenting clarity. She could still hear Richard Langston's voice booming, feel the weight of 100 eyes on her, see the way his finger jabbed at a barely visible smear on the glass table. What clung to her more than his fury, however, was the silence that had followed. Her silence. For years, she had perfected the art of being invisible. It wasn't simply about survival, it was about preserving dignity in a world that rarely extended it to people like her. She had swallowed countless small insults, brushed aside countless moments of being overlooked, all because she knew the fragile security of her job could not withstand defiance. Yet, standing in the lobby that morning, with Langston's rage crashing against her, she hadn't felt small. She had felt something else, something heavier. That silence wasn't weakness. It was a weight. A choice. A force waiting to be released. At the tower the next morning, whispers still lingered in the air like the aftertaste of bitter coffee. Executives rushed to their meetings, but their eyes flicked toward Amara as she moved through the lobby with her cart. It wasn't pity she saw in their glances, it was curiosity. She had become the subject of an unspoken narrative. She didn't break, someone whispered in passing. I don't know how she stayed so calm, another replied. Even those who tried to avoid gossip couldn't help but wonder about her silence. Why hadn't she cried? Why hadn't she apologized? Why hadn't she begged to keep her job like so many others before her? The absence of reaction created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, imaginations filled the space with meaning. Langston himself noticed. On the 42nd floor, where the city spread out beneath his office windows like a conquered kingdom, he stood before his desk, replaying the incident in his mind. He had expected submission. Fear. A mumbled apology followed by frantic scrubbing. Instead, he had been met with stillness, eyes that did not cower, silence that did not crack. He found himself unsettled, though he would never admit it aloud. Schedule the investor's call for Friday, he barked at his assistant, shaking the thought away. But as he signed documents and dictated memos, the image of Amara's steady gaze returned like an itch he couldn't scratch. For Amara, silence was not merely the absence of words, it was the accumulation of everything unsaid. She carried with her the memory of her grandmother, who had scrubbed the floors of wealthy estates in the South, enduring insults that could have broken lesser spirits. She carried the memory of her mother, who had raised her on a seamstress's wages, teaching her that dignity was a shield no one could take unless she surrendered it. That shield had been in her hands yesterday when Langston roared. And instead of dropping it, she had held it higher, without speaking a word. By lunchtime, she found herself in the service corridor, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and chatter from the executive cafeteria above. Her co-workers joined her at the small break table, their plastic containers of food steaming in the cramped space. "You okay, Amara?" one of the janitors asked gently. "I saw what happened yesterday." "I'm fine," she said simply, and she meant it. The others nodded. They didn't press her for details. They didn't need to. They understood what silence could carry. But upstairs, in polished dining rooms where mahogany tables gleamed and expensive wine glasses clinked, her silence was a different story. It became a puzzle. Executives speculated in hushed voices between bites of salmon and asparagus. Some said she was too naive to know she should fear for her job. Others said she was shrewd, that she was waiting, calculating her next move. One director leaned back in his chair and said, that silence was louder than a scream. It made him look ridiculous. His companions shifted uncomfortably but did not disagree. By midweek, the weight of her silence had seeped beyond the walls of Langston and Myers Tower. A client who had witnessed the confrontation mentioned it to colleagues at a dinner party. The CEO yelled at a maid, the client recounted, and she just stood there, quiet as stone. You could feel the whole room tilt. Laughter followed, but it was edged with unease. The story spread like wildfire through the city's business circles. Amara remained unaware of how far her silence traveled. She moved from floor to floor with her cleaning cart, polishing brass railings, wiping glass doors, replenishing supplies. But everywhere she went, she felt the eyes. They lingered on her longer now, curious, watchful. And though no one said it outright, she knew her silence had unsettled the tower more than any protest could have. In quiet moments, she thought of what it had cost her. It would have been easier to cry, easier to apologize, easier to vanish into the shadows of the lobby. But then she remembered the trembling hands of her grandmother, scrubbing floors for people who never bothered to learn her name. She remembered her mother's words, "Your silence is not nothing. It's the weight of everything they refuse to see." Now, she was carrying that weight. And she was beginning to understand its power. Late that Friday afternoon, Richard Langston descended again to the lobby, striding toward the front doors with his usual air of command. His phone pressed to his ear, his voice sharp. He barely noticed Amara at first. She was polishing the chrome handle of the main entrance, her movement steady, unhurried. Then she looked up. Just for a moment. Their eyes met. It was not defiance she gave him, nor apology, nor fear. It was silence, pure, unbroken, unflinching. Langston faltered mid-sentence, the words in his mouth stumbling. His assistant glanced up at him, startled. But Amara simply turned back to the chrome handle, cloth moving in calm circles. The CEO, who had commanded boardrooms and conquered rivals with his voice, found himself wordless in that brief exchange. The weight of silence was heavier than his commanding voice. And somewhere deep inside, he knew it. By Monday morning, the tower hummed with anticipation. The incident in the lobby had refused to fade like other scandals of the week. Instead, it had rooted itself in the marrow of the company, threading its way into conversations, emails, and nervous glances. Amara's silence still lingered, a ghost that haunted every corridor. Employees carried it in their whispers, executives carried it in their unease, and even Richard Langston carried it in his restless pacing behind glass walls on the top floor. That morning, a company-wide meeting had been announced, a rare occurrence that immediately ignited speculation. Normally, Langston confined himself to boardrooms and investor calls, but today, he would address employees in the atrium, the open space spanning 5 floors with balconies overlooking the marble lobby. It was billed as a motivational address, but everyone knew better. It was damage control. By 9 o'clock, the atrium was crowded. Employees leaned over balcony railings, clustered on staircases, and gathered in small groups across the lobby floor. Security guards stood stiffly at the edges, radios clipped to their belts. The hum of conversation filled the air, tense and electric. Amara wheeled her cleaning cart to the edge of the room, unseen by most, but she felt the currents in the air. She wasn't meant to be here, her duties rarely brought her to large gatherings. Yet something compelled her to linger. The whispers of the past week had grown into something else, a pressure, a question hanging in the air. "What's he going to say?" one intern muttered near the stairwell. "Probably some speech about excellence," replied another. "About discipline, hard work, the usual performance." But everyone saw, a woman said quietly. "He humiliated her. How's he going to spin that?" At that moment, the doors opened, and Richard Langston entered. His presence sliced through the atrium like a blade. He wore a deep navy suit, the color of authority, and his platinum watch caught the light as he raised a hand for silence. The conversations died instantly. All eyes turned to him. He climbed the short platform at the base of the atrium, positioned himself behind a sleek black podium, and surveyed the room. Rows of faces stared back, wary, curious, expectant. Langston straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and began. "Excellence," he said, his voice booming through the microphone, "is not a suggestion at Langston and Myers. It is the foundation on which we stand." His words echoed through the chamber, rehearsed and polished. He spoke of discipline, of the company's reputation, of the responsibility each employee carried. He reminded them of their victories, their market dominance, their place at the pinnacle of industry. He painted himself as the guardian of standards, the protector of legacy. But beneath the sheen of rhetoric, there was a pulse of defensiveness. Those gathered could feel it. The speech wasn't about them, it was about him. About his authority, about reasserting control over a narrative that had begun to slip. Amara, standing quietly at the edge of the lobby, felt his words like stones thrown into water. Each one landed heavily, but none rippled through her. She had heard them before, in different forms, from men who believed power gave them the right to diminish others. The performance was meant to dazzle, but she saw the cracks. As Langston spoke, her presence began to attract attention. Someone on the second-floor balcony nudged a colleague, pointing subtly toward the woman in the uniform. Another whispered, "That's her." The word spread, traveling upward and outward. "That's the maid. The one from the lobby. She's here." Within minutes, the gathering of eyes shifted. Not all, not obviously, but enough. The weight of the atrium's attention began to divide between the man at the podium and the woman by the cleaning cart. Langston felt it before he saw it. He had commanded rooms long enough to know when his grip slipped. His eyes flickered across the crowd, seeking the disturbance. And then he saw her. Amara stood near the glass doors, her hands folded calmly over her cloth, her posture straight, her face serene. She wasn't interrupting, wasn't protesting, wasn't even moving. Yet her stillness radiated more power than the cadence of his speech. For a moment, his voice faltered. The pause was brief, barely a breath, but it was enough. Every ear caught it. Every eye registered it. And in that heartbeat of hesitation, the balance of the room tilted. Langston clenched the edges of the podium, his jaw tightening. He raised his voice, louder now, more forceful, as if volume alone could restore the command slipping from his grasp. "This company," he declared, "will never tolerate complacency. Every detail matters. Every task, large or small, reflects who we are." His words struck like hammers, each syllable aimed at regaining ground. But the crowd wasn't leaning forward anymore. They were looking sideways, down, across, toward the maid whose silence had already rewritten the script. Amara felt their eyes, but she did not flinch. She did not bow her head or slip away into the service corridor. Instead, she remained, steady and composed. Her silence filled the atrium as tangibly as Langston's voice. By the end of his speech, the applause that followed was polite but thin, scattered, lacking conviction. Langston forced a smile, thanked the crowd, and stepped down from the podium. But he could feel it, the difference. He had spoken at them, but she had spoken without speaking at all. As the crowd began to disperse, groups formed again in corners, on stairwells, by elevators. But now the whispers carried a different tone. Did you see her? She didn't even move. She was calmer than he was. He looked, unsettled. The gathering of eyes had witnessed something Langston hadn't intended, a contrast too stark to ignore. His booming rhetoric beside her unshakable silence. His performance against her presence. Back in the service corridor, Amara wheeled her cart toward the elevator reserved for staff. She exhaled slowly, feeling the invisible threads of the moment tugging tighter around her. The silence she carried had grown heavier, more potent. She had not planned to challenge him, not yet. But the gathering of eyes had made her into something she had never expected, a mirror. And in that mirror, everyone could see the truth Langston tried to bury: power did not always roar. Sometimes, it stood still. The atrium speech had ended days ago, but its echoes lingered in the building like the faint smell of smoke after a fire. Employees carried the memory of the moment with them, Langston's booming words straining against the calm, steady presence of the maid who never flinched. Conversations about it still hummed in elevators, in hushed tones near the coffee machine, and in hurried exchanges by the photocopier. She didn't even move. He paused when he saw her. Did you notice how the crowd looked at her instead of him? Each remark was small, fleeting, but together they formed an undercurrent that refused to dissipate. The spark had been struck, though few realized it yet. Amara did. She felt it in the way people looked at her now, not as though she were invisible, but as though she carried some unspoken truth. When she pushed her cleaning cart through the polished hallways, eyes lingered on her longer. Some were sympathetic, others cautious, still others calculating. She did not bask in the attention, but she understood what it meant. Power was shifting, subtly but surely. That shift became clearer one afternoon when she entered the executive break room. The place was rarely empty, but at that moment, 3 directors sat at the marble counter sipping espressos, their conversation halting as she walked in. They fell silent, their eyes darting to her and then back to their cups. Amara ignored them, humming softly to herself as she wiped down the counters. Imagine the optics if that got out, one muttered under his breath. Keep your voice down, another hissed, but it was too late. Amara had heard. She said nothing. Her silence was deliberate, her movements slow and precise, but her presence pressed on them until one shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The 3rd director coughed, pretending to check his phone, desperate to escape the room's tension. When she left, the 3 exchanged uneasy looks. They had just been reminded that secrets had ears, and that silence, sometimes, carried more weight than confrontation. For Amara, defiance didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It flickered at first, like embers at the edge of a dying fire. Each time she held her silence in the face of a sneer, each time she looked back without lowering her eyes, each time she walked away without bowing her head, the embers glowed hotter. She wasn't challenging Langston outright, but she was refusing to play the part he had written for her. Her spark grew brighter one Thursday morning. Langston arrived earlier than usual, his jaw tight, his temper already simmering from an investor call gone sour. He strode into the lobby, coat draped over his arm, and immediately spotted Amara polishing the brass fixtures near the revolving doors. "You again," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. His voice carried disdain, as though her presence offended him. Amara looked up calmly, her cloth still in her hand. "Good morning, sir," she said evenly. The simplicity of her greeting disarmed him. He had expected her to cower, to avert her eyes, to scurry away. Instead, she acknowledged him with the quiet civility of an equal. He scowled. "Make sure those doors shine. Clients will be arriving in an hour, and I won't have them walking into filth." Amara's gaze flicked to the brass, gleaming so brightly it mirrored his reflection. Without breaking eye contact, she replied, "They already shine." The words were soft, polite, but their edge was undeniable. Around them, a handful of employees froze, ears pricking at the exchange. Langston stiffened, his hand tightening around the strap of his leather briefcase. For a moment, the air vibrated with the threat of explosion. He could yell, could fire her on the spot, could unleash the torrent everyone feared. But something in her composure stopped him. He saw no fear in her, no nervous trembling. Her defiance wasn't loud, it was measured, controlled, undeniable. With a dismissive grunt, he turned and stalked toward the elevators. The doors slid closed behind him, but the tension remained. Employees glanced at one another, their expressions a mixture of shock and awe. "She said that to him," someone whispered. She didn't even raise her voice. And he walked away. The spark of defiance had caught flame. By the end of the week, the story of the brass doors had circulated through every department. Each retelling added a little more fire. Some said she had stared him down until he looked away, others claimed he had turned red with frustration. What mattered wasn't the details, it was the perception. Amara had spoken, and she had not been crushed. The effect rippled outward. In small meetings, mid-level managers began to question directives more openly. Assistants hesitated less before voicing concerns. Even interns, once terrified to breathe too loudly, carried themselves with a little more courage. They didn't credit Amara directly, but the shift was undeniable. She had given them a glimpse of something rare, the possibility of standing their ground. Down in the service corridors, among her fellow staff, Amara noticed the difference too. They smiled at her more, spoke to her with a new warmth. "You gave him a taste of his own medicine," one janitor chuckled. "You're braver than all of us," another said. Amara only smiled. She didn't feel like a warrior or a revolutionary. She simply felt free. Free of the weight that had pressed her into silence for so long. Langston, however, felt anything but free. He brooded in his office, reviewing reports with unnecessary harshness, snapping at assistants, pacing like a caged animal. His empire was intact, his authority unchallenged on paper, but he felt the tremors beneath the surface. He had been shaken, not once but twice, first by her silence, then by her measured defiance. He couldn't understand it. She was a maid, a background figure, a person whose job it was to remain unseen. How had she become the center of attention? Why did his employees whisper about her instead of him? Why, when he replayed the moment by the brass doors, did he feel like he had been the one dismissed? His reflection in the polished table of his office stared back at him, and for the first time, he wondered if control could be lost not by a rival's power, but by a maid's refusal to bow. That evening, as Amara locked away her cart and folded her cloths, she paused by the service exit. The city stretched beyond, humming with life and light. She closed her eyes and exhaled, the words from earlier echoing in her mind, "They already shine." She hadn't planned them. They had risen unbidden, like a truth that had been waiting to be spoken. And though they were small, simple words, they had carried more weight than she imagined possible. The spark of defiance had been lit. And sparks, when fed, could set towers ablaze. The tension in Langston and Myers Tower had reached a breaking point. For weeks, whispers trailed Amara through the halls, carried from the lowest janitorial closet to the highest boardroom. Her silence had unsettled. Her calm defiance had inspired. And now, the atmosphere within the tower felt like a storm trapped behind glass, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Richard Langston felt it most of all. The CEO who once commanded fear with every syllable now sensed control slipping from his grip. He barked orders louder, held meetings longer, demanded results faster. But his fury no longer silenced the room as it once had. The employees listened, but their eyes betrayed a quiet question: what if power could be resisted? By Thursday morning, he decided to reclaim his dominance once and for all. A high-profile investor tour was scheduled. Clients from London and Dubai would arrive to walk through the gleaming headquarters, to be dazzled by the empire he had built. Langston saw it as his chance to reset the narrative, to prove that nothing, not gossip, not whispers, not a maid's quiet defiance, could shake him. The atrium was staged to perfection. Glass tables gleamed, brass fixtures shone, fresh flowers lined the marble reception desk. Assistants bustled about in pencil skirts and suits, murmuring into headsets. Security stood sharp at attention. Every detail screamed excellence. And at the edge of it all, Amara moved with her cart, her cloth folding neatly in her hands. She hadn't sought this moment, but she felt it approaching. It was there in the way employees' eyes flicked toward her, waiting. It was there in the way silence followed her steps. And it was there in the way Langston's gaze locked onto her the moment he entered the atrium with his investors. "Here we are, gentlemen," he said, his voice booming with pride. "The finest financial headquarters on this side of the Atlantic. Every detail matters here. Every inch reflects our standards." The clients nodded politely, their eyes scanning the polished space. Langston gestured toward the towering glass walls, the soaring ceilings, the artwork imported from Italy. But as he turned back, his gaze landed on Amara. She was kneeling near the base of a pillar, polishing the chrome trim. Calm, steady, as if unaware of the grand performance unfolding above her. For Langston, her presence was like grit in a diamond, small, but intolerable. He stopped mid-sentence. The investors followed his gaze. A ripple of silence spread across the atrium. Employees froze. Amara rose slowly, cloth still in hand, and turned toward him. And then it happened. Langston's commanding voice, so rehearsed, so precise, cracked under the weight of his pride. "How many times," he thundered, "do I have to remind people that excellence is not optional? Even now, in front of our most valued clients, I see work that is, less than perfect." The word struck like a whip, echoing through the atrium. His finger pointed at Amara. "You. This is exactly what I mean. Mediocrity, complacency." The sentence was cut short. Amara straightened her shoulders, turned her gaze on him, and spoke for the first time in weeks. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, calm, clear, resonant, cutting through the marble chamber with a precision no shout could match. "Mr. Langston, the only thing not shining in this tower, is you." The words hung in the air like a bell struck in silence. For a moment, the atrium froze. Employees stared, mouths parted. The investors exchanged startled glances. Even the security guard seemed rooted to the floor. The sentence was simple, but its truth was undeniable. In one breath, she had named what everyone felt but no one dared to say. The flaw was not in the glass or the brass or the tables. It was in him. Langston's face drained of color, then flushed crimson. He opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in memory, the man who always had something to say was speechless. His commanding voice had met its match, not in volume, but in clarity. The silence that followed was thunderous. And then, slowly, like the rustle of wind through leaves, came the whispers. From the balcony railings, from the staircases, from the lobby floor. She said it. She told him. She's right. The investors, uncomfortable but intrigued, studied Amara with new eyes. One of them, a dignified man in a gray suit, leaned toward Langston and murmured something too soft for others to hear. Langston stiffened, his jaw clenching. The humiliation was complete. But Amara did not gloat. She did not smile or bow. She simply lowered her cloth, placed it neatly back into her cart, and turned away. Her task was finished, her truth spoken. She resumed her work with the same quiet dignity she always carried, leaving the weight of her words behind her. Upstairs, in the aftermath, the building buzzed like a hive disturbed. Executives gathered in clusters, debating what had just happened. "Did you hear her?" She said it right to his face. "I've never seen him look like that before." She didn't yell, she didn't threaten, she just told the truth. The story spread faster than any memo, faster than any email. By the end of the day, it had reached every department. By the end of the week, it had left the building entirely, carried into the city's business circles, whispered at dinners, murmured in boardrooms. Langston tried to reassert control, but his efforts only fueled the fire. Every angry command, every sharp reprimand, was now measured against the sentence that had cut him down. "The only thing not shining, is you." The spark of defiance had become ablaze. And Amara, who had once been invisible, had become the mirror in which everyone could see the truth about power, pride, and dignity. That night, Amara returned to her small apartment, setting her uniform carefully on the chair as always. She sat at her table, tea steaming in her chipped mug, and exhaled deeply. The words she had spoken replayed in her mind, not with regret, not with fear, but with a calm certainty. She had not planned them. They had risen like a tide, inevitable, undeniable. And once spoken, they could not be taken back. The sentence had not only shocked everyone else. It had freed her. And in that freedom, she realized, the balance of the tower, and perhaps her life, would never be the same. The building had never felt so alive with whispers. After Amara's sentence cut through the marble atrium like a blade, the atmosphere of Langston and Myers Tower shifted permanently. The words replayed themselves in hushed conversations, in hurried texts, in nervous laughter that tried and failed to disguise awe. "The only thing not shining in this tower, is you." Employees repeated it as though it were scripture. Some spoke the line with reverence, others with disbelief, others with delight. But no one could deny its impact. It had stripped away the aura of invincibility surrounding Richard Langston and revealed something raw, his humanity, and his flaws. Langston retreated into his office on the top floor after the incident, blinds drawn, door locked. Meetings were cancelled, calls delayed. Assistants scrambled nervously, but none dared to disturb him. His silence now mirrored Amara's, though his was born of humiliation, not strength. Amara, meanwhile, continued her work as though nothing had changed. She polished chrome, wiped tables, replenished paper towels. To the casual observer, she was the same maid she had been the day before. But to those watching closely, she was transformed. Her silence now carried not just weight but authority. Her presence drew eyes. Her truth, spoken aloud, had shifted the balance of the entire tower. The following day, she entered the break room where the service staff gathered for lunch. The air was charged with energy. Conversations halted as she walked in, but this time the silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent. "You said it," one janitor finally whispered, his voice thick with pride. "You said what we've all thought for years." Amara set down her lunch bag and smiled softly. "I only told the truth," she said. A cook leaned forward eagerly. "But do you know what it means?" The investors heard it. The directors heard it. Everyone knows now. You've shown him for what he is. Amara shook her head. "I didn't do it for them. I did it because I couldn't carry it anymore." They nodded, understanding. For years, they had endured the arrogance, the dismissals, the casual cruelty of the tower's elite. But Amara had borne the brunt of it most of all. And now, her truth was no longer hidden, it was spoken, undeniable. That afternoon, word spread that the board of directors had convened an emergency meeting. Behind the closed doors of the 42nd floor boardroom, voices rose and fell in heated debate. "He embarrassed himself," one director said firmly. "And in front of international investors. He embarrassed the company," another added. A third leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a pen against the table. "What unsettles me most is how the employees look at her now. She has their respect in a way he no longer does." The room fell into uneasy silence. The truth was dangerous, and they all knew it. Amara had spoken only one sentence, but it had pierced through the layers of fear and obedience that held the company together. "What do you propose we do?" one finally asked. "Nothing," came the reply. "For now. Let it play out." But beneath their words was an unspoken agreement. The balance of power within Langston and Myers had shifted. Amara's truth extended beyond the tower. By the end of the week, blogs whispered about the incident. Anonymous employees leaked fragments of the story online, a CEO humiliated. A maid who spoke the truth. The details blurred in retelling, but the essence remained. The world beyond the glass walls was beginning to learn what had happened inside. For Amara, the attention was overwhelming. Strangers whispered her name in the cafeteria. Employees she had never spoken to smiled at her in hallways. Some treated her like a heroine, others with nervous distance, as though proximity to her might ignite trouble. But the truth she had spoken was not meant to make her a symbol. It had been a release. For years, she had swallowed the weight of silence, endured the humiliation of invisibility. When she finally spoke, she had not sought glory. She had sought freedom. That night, in her apartment, she sat by the window overlooking the city lights. The chipped mug of tea steamed in her hands. For the first time in years, she felt lighter. She thought of her grandmother, bent over floors that would never remember her hands. She thought of her mother, sewing late into the night for people who would never know her name. Their silence had been survival. But Amara's silence, and then her words, had become something else, resistance. Her truth was not only hers, it was theirs, carried forward through her. In the tower the next morning, the investors returned for a follow-up meeting. They moved through the polished hallways with guarded expressions, whispering quietly to one another. Langston followed behind, his smile strained, his posture rigid. As they passed the lobby, their eyes fell again on Amara. She stood by the entrance, cloth in hand, polishing the glass doors. Her movements were calm, unhurried. She didn't glance up, didn't acknowledge their stares. She didn't need to. The investors exchanged looks, then one murmured, "That's her." Langston's jaw clenched. Her truth had become part of the building itself, inseparable from the gleaming walls and shining floors. By the end of the week, a memo circulated quietly among the service staff. It was unsigned, anonymous, but its words struck like sparks. Dignity is not given, it is claimed. Remember that. Amara suspected she knew who had written it, but she said nothing. She folded the paper neatly, slipped it into her apron pocket, and returned to work. The truth was spreading, not through speeches or policies, but through whispers, courage, and the weight of her example. On Friday evening, as the last employees trickled out of the tower, Amara lingered in the atrium. The marble floors gleamed under the glow of the chandeliers. She ran her cloth over the glass table where it had all begun, the table where Langston's fury had first landed on her like a storm. She paused, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. For the first time, she did not see invisibility. She saw presence. She saw dignity. She saw truth. And she knew then, whatever came next, whether retaliation from Langston, whether gossip from employees, whether silence from the board, she had already won something no one could take away. She had spoken her truth. And it had set her free. The sentence still echoed through Langston and Myers Tower, days and weeks after it had been spoken. It lingered in corners, whispered on stairwells, passed from office to office like contraband truth. The only thing not shining in this tower, is you. It had become more than a sentence. It was a verdict. And like all verdicts, it demanded a price. For Richard Langston, that price came in fragments. Investors began calling with concerns couched in polite phrases. "We respect your leadership," one said, "but we've heard unsettling stories about how you treat staff." Clients, once eager to boast of their association with his company, now asked questions in cautious tones. Behind his back, directors muttered about optics and reputation damage. Langston felt the ground shifting beneath him, and with it, his grip on control. He became harsher in meetings, sharper in tone, desperate to claw back the fear he once commanded. But fear no longer carried the same weight. Every barked order, every snapped insult, was measured against Amara's quiet truth. His voice, once omnipotent, now rang hollow. For Amara, the price of recognition came in subtler, heavier ways. She had not asked to be a symbol, yet the tower treated her as one. Employees approached her in hallways, offering smiles, whispered thanks, or nervous encouragement. "You gave us courage," one said. "You said what we couldn't." Another murmured, "You changed things." But with recognition came expectation. People looked at her differently now, not just as a maid, but as someone carrying their hopes, their frustrations, their silent anger. It was flattering, but it was also a burden. She had spoken one sentence, but now it seemed as though everyone waited for her next. The board of directors eventually summoned Langston for a private meeting. He entered the room like a man marching into battle, shoulders squared, jaw tight. The directors sat around the long oak table, their faces grim. "Richard," one began cautiously, "your leadership has always been formidable. But we can't ignore what's happened. Investors are talking. Employees are restless. The story has spread beyond these walls." Langston's eyes flashed. You're telling me a maid's insolence matters more than decades of success. It's not just about her, another director said. It's about what she revealed. People saw you differently. They saw the truth. Langston slammed a fist onto the table. She's nothing. She cleans tables, polishes brass. She doesn't belong in conversations like this. The silence that followed was damning. Even he could feel it. For the first time, he realized the directors weren't afraid of him anymore. They were afraid of the truth. Downstairs, Amara continued her work as always. She polished, wiped, tidied, moved through the building with her quiet grace. But the weight of recognition pressed harder each day. In the cafeteria, a young assistant leaned across her table. "You don't know what you've done for us," she whispered. "We used to think he was untouchable. But when you spoke," she broke off, eyes shining. "You reminded us he's just a man." Amara smiled gently, but her heart was heavy. She had not meant to lead a movement. She had only spoken her truth. And yet, the price of recognition was that truth could not be contained. Once freed, it belonged to everyone. The climax came 2 weeks later. The board announced an internal restructuring. Though the language was polished and vague, strategic redirection, new leadership focus, the meaning was clear: Richard Langston's authority was being curtailed. His decisions would now be subject to oversight. His voice, once absolute, was now only one among many. Employees celebrated quietly. In break rooms and service corridors, smiles were exchanged, relief palpable. But no one celebrated louder than Amara. She did not dance, did not boast, did not even allow herself more than a brief sigh of relief. Brief sigh of relief. For she knew, recognition came with cost, and the cost was never paid by power alone. The following morning, she found an envelope slipped into her cart. It bore no name, only the company seal. Inside was a letter. "We recognize your service and the dignity you have brought to this company. As a gesture of respect, we offer you a new position, Supervisor of Facilities. You will oversee staff, manage operations, and represent the department in executive meetings." Amara read the words twice, her hands trembling slightly. A promotion. Recognition. Power of her own, however modest. But as she folded the letter, she realized what it truly meant. She was no longer invisible. She had been seen. That evening, she sat once again at her small kitchen table, tea steaming in her chipped mug. She thought of her grandmother, whose hands had bled scrubbing floors for people who never learned her name. She thought of her mother, who had stitched clothes through sleepless nights so her daughter could have a better life. And she thought of herself, standing in a marble lobby, speaking one sentence that changed everything. The price of recognition was heavy, eyes that expected more, voices that whispered her name, a company forever altered by her truth. But it was a price she was willing to bear. Because recognition, however costly, was better than invisibility. Her reflection in the window looked back at her, calm, steady, shining in a way no glass or brass ever could. In the tower the next day, employees greeted her differently. Not as a maid, but as a presence. Not as a background figure, but as someone who had shifted the ground beneath their feet. Some nodded respectfully. Some smiled. And some simply whispered her name as she passed. As for Richard Langston, he walked the halls with a shadow clinging to him. His commanding voice had lost its sheen. His words no longer carried the same power. He had paid his price too, the price of arrogance revealed, the price of a truth too sharp to silence. In the end, Amara's legacy was not a sentence spoken in anger, but a truth spoken in clarity. Power that roars is fragile. Power that stands in silence is unbreakable. She had discovered her truth. She had borne the price of recognition. And she had proven, once and for all, that dignity, once claimed, could never again be erased.